101 insane coincidences that will shock you. Some facts are so bizarre, they feel like glitches in reality. A man survived both atomic bombings, then lived to 93. Two U.S. presidents, born a century apart, shared identical fates. A novel eerily predicted the Titanic disaster years before it happened. These mind-blowing coincidences will make you question how random life really is. Stay till the end, because some of these are so impossible, they defy logic itself. 1. Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy shared a list of eerie coincidences. Both were elected to Congress 100 years apart, then became president exactly a century apart. Both were assassinated on a Friday while sitting next to their wives, and both were succeeded by a man named Johnson. Even weirder? Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy, and Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln. Just a strange historical quirk or something deeper. 2. In 1937, a man named Joseph Figlock was walking down a Detroit alley when a baby fell from a fourth-story window, landing right in his arms. The child survived. But here's where it gets bizarre. Exactly 1 year later, another baby fell from the same building and was caught by the same man. Either Figlock had superhuman reflexes, or fate had a twisted sense of humor. 3. The Civil War officially ended in April 1865. That same month, a young woman in Washington, D.C. bought a black mourning dress, just in case something bad happened. 2 weeks later, she attended Abraham Lincoln's funeral in that very dress. Who was she? Mary Todd Lincoln, the president's wife. Some call it foresight, others call it an unsettling premonition. 4. The Wright brothers and Neil Armstrong were born just 60 miles apart in Ohio. The first people to build a plane and the first man to walk on the moon both came from the same small region of the U.S. The birthplace of flight and the birthplace of moonwalkers. What are the odds? 5. In 1863, Robert Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's son, was saved from a train accident by Edwin Booth, a famous actor. 2 years later, Edwin's brother, John Wilkes Booth, assassinated Abraham Lincoln. Imagine being rescued by one brother, only to have the other change the course of history forever. 6. Mark Twain was born in 1835, the same year Halley's Comet passed by Earth. He famously predicted he'd die when it returned. In 1910, as the comet streaked through the sky, Twain passed away. An American literary giant, entering and exiting with celestial precision. 7. In 1974, a book titled Futility told the story of an unsinkable luxury ship named the Titan, which struck an iceberg and sank. The book was written 14 years before the Titanic disaster. The fictional ship and the real Titanic had eerily similar dimensions, lifeboat shortages, and even a similar number of passengers. Was it just an incredible coincidence, or did the author, Morgan Robertson, tap into something beyond logic? 8. The first and last American soldiers killed in World War I are buried in a cemetery in France. Their graves lie exactly 15 feet apart, facing each other. The eerie part? Their deaths occurred at nearly the same spot, 4 years apart, on the very first and very last day of the war. 9. In 2007, a woman in Oklahoma bought a used book online. When it arrived, she opened the cover and saw a name written inside. It was her own father's childhood copy, lost decades ago. Somehow, after passing through unknown hands and possibly multiple states, the book found its way back to her. 10. In 1920, 3 men named John Thomas all checked into the same hotel in New York. They didn't know each other. None of them had booked in advance. And yet, they were all assigned to the same room. The hotel staff was so baffled that they double-checked the records, but everything was correct. Sometimes the universe just has a strange sense of organization. 11. A small town in Illinois has been struck by a meteorite 3 times. In 1928, a small rock crashed into a farmer's field. In 1935, another one hit a barn. In 1950, yet another meteorite smashed through a store's roof. Scientists say the odds of this happening are beyond calculation, but residents just call it bad luck. 12. 2 men invented the telephone at the exact same time, but only one got the patent. Alexander Graham Bell and Elisha Gray both filed patents for the telephone on the exact same day, February 14, 1876. Bell got his paperwork in first by just 2 hours, which is why we know his name instead of Gray's. If Gray had gotten there first, we'd be saying Gray phone instead of Bell phone. 13. In 1973, a Michigan woman was driving on the freeway when lightning struck a tree beside the road. The impact caused the tree to fall right onto her car. She survived. A year later, in the same spot, she was driving again when another lightning strike felled another tree. This time, her car was totaled. If that wasn't bad enough, the following year, a third lightning strike hit her home. Some people have bad luck. She had an electrical storm for a personal stalker. 14. A pair of twin brothers were separated at birth, adopted by different families, and lived nearly identical lives. Both were named James, grew up loving math and carpentry, married women named Linda, had sons with the same name, divorced, and remarried women named Betty. They met each other at age 39, realizing their lives had mirrored each other's the entire time. 15. A man survived falling out of a plane, only to get hit by a bus moments later. In 1943, an American pilot was shot down over France. His parachute didn't open, but he landed in a haystack, cushioning his fall. He stood up completely unharmed and was immediately hit by a passing bus. He survived that too. 16. In 1974, a man in Chicago was walking down the street when a poodle fell from the 13th floor of a high-rise, landing directly on him. The man was killed instantly. The weird part? Just minutes earlier, 2 other pedestrians had narrowly avoided being hit by the same dog. 3 near victims, 1 unlucky man. 17. The year was 1920. A baseball player named Ray Chapman was hit in the head by a pitch and died, one of the only deaths ever recorded from an in-game incident. Exactly 50 years later, another player, Carl Mays, threw a pitch that hit a batter in nearly the same way. Mays' connection. He was the pitcher who had thrown the fatal ball that killed Ray Chapman. 18. In 1980, a Texas man named Joe Simpson checked into a hospital after a heart attack. At the same moment, another Joe Simpson, completely unrelated, was also admitted for a heart attack. They were given beds next to each other. A few hours later, they both died, minutes apart. 19. The Great Chicago Fire and the Peshtigo Fire happened on the same day, but only one is famous. On October 8, 1871, a massive fire destroyed much of Chicago. But on that very same day, the deadliest wildfire in U.S. history burned through Peshtigo, Wisconsin, killing over 1,500 people. Chicago's fire became legendary, while the far deadlier Peshtigo fire was mostly forgotten. 20. In 2001, 2 identical twins in Ohio were killed in separate car accidents, on the same highway, under nearly identical conditions, just hours apart. The accidents were so similar that investigators initially thought it was a mix-up. It wasn't. It was just one of the strangest twin connections ever recorded. 21. 2 kids took the same photo at Disneyland, 30 years before they met and got married. A couple from California found an old childhood photo of the wife at Disneyland. In the background, her future husband, also posing for a photo with his family. They had never met as kids but had unknowingly been in the same place at the same time. 22. In 1898, 2 men, both named Robert Lincoln, were arrested for horse theft in Illinois. They had never met before, yet they had the same name, the same birth date, and even the same father's name. They were held in separate cells but repeatedly asked if the police were playing a trick on them. 23. In 1994, a freak accident occurred in Miami when 2 identical cars, driven by 2 women named Patricia, collided at an intersection. Each woman had a son named James in the passenger seat. None of them were related, and neither Patricia had any idea the other existed. 24. In 1965, a man in New Orleans survived being struck by lightning. That would have been remarkable on its own, but here's the kicker. He had survived lightning strikes 6 times before that. His name? Roy Sullivan, the man who would later become famous as the most lightning-struck person in history. 25. On November 22, 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated. On that very same day, two of the most famous authors in the world, C.S. Lewis and Aldous Huxley, also passed away. But because of Kennedy's death, their passings went almost unnoticed in the news. 26. In 1950, a streetcar accident in New York City left dozens injured. Among the victims were two men, both named James Wilkins, both born on the same day, both working the same job at different companies. Even stranger? They had never met before, yet their injuries were nearly identical. 27. A man's heart stopped for exactly 9 minutes. On September 9, 1999, at 9:09 p.m., doctors in a Seattle hospital were stunned when a patient went into cardiac arrest at exactly 9:09 p.m. on September 9, 1999. Even weirder, he was revived exactly 9 minutes later. No one could explain why his time of death perfectly aligned with that eerie date. 28. The year was 1975, and a man in Florida was enjoying a drink on his porch when a bullet from nowhere struck him in the chest. He survived, but the police never found the shooter. 10 years later, in the same house, his son sat in the exact same spot and was shot by a stray bullet in the exact same way. He survived too. 29. In 1953, a Swedish journalist interviewed a man about his experiences during World War II. The man recalled being a prisoner of war, surviving bombings, and escaping capture. Later, the journalist realized something insane. He had been a pilot who had dropped bombs on the very camp where this man had been imprisoned. 30. The Titanic and its sister ship, the Olympic, were eerily similar in design. But what's truly chilling is that a man named Charles Lightoller served on both ships and survived both disasters. Even more incredible? He later survived a third shipwreck during World War I. If there was ever a person who should have just stayed on dry land, it was him. 31. In 1983, a small plane crashed into a lake in Wisconsin. The sole survivor, a baby girl, was pulled from the wreckage unharmed. 20 years later, she became a flight attendant. One day, while on duty, she met an elderly pilot who, after hearing her story, revealed that he was the one who had rescued her from the lake all those years ago. 32. A New Jersey man was once struck by lightning while standing outside his home. Not only did he survive, but a year later, his dog was hit by lightning in the exact same spot. Both lived. After that, he installed a lightning rod just in case Mother Nature had more unfinished business. 33. On December 5, 1664, a ship sank off the coast of Wales. Another ship with nearly the same name sank in the same area on December 5, 1785. And if that's not eerie enough, a third ship went down in the exact same spot on December 5, 1820. The kicker? All three ships had only one survivor, and every single one of them was named Hugh Williams. 34. In 1899, a man in Texas was sentenced to death for murder. His defense? It wasn't me, it was my twin. The court didn't believe him, and he was executed. A decade later, his twin brother confessed to the crime on his deathbed. 35. The Simpsons predicted multiple U.S. events, including Trump's presidency and Disney buying Fox. In a 2000 episode, The Simpsons aired a joke about Donald Trump becoming president. 16 years later, it happened. In 1998, they aired an episode where Disney bought 20th Century Fox, exactly 19 years before the real-life acquisition. At this point, the writers might actually be time travelers. 36. The same person was randomly selected for jury duty 14 times. A woman in Florida was called for jury duty 14 times in 20 years, even though the selection process is supposed to be completely random. Statisticians calculated that the odds of this happening were less than 1 in 10 billion. 37. In 1950, a church choir in Beatrice, Nebraska, was supposed to meet for practice at 7:25 p.m. sharp. But every single member, all 15 of them, was late for different reasons. One overslept, one had car trouble, another got distracted. At 7:27 p.m., just 2 minutes after they were all supposed to be inside, a gas explosion completely destroyed the church. If any of them had been on time, they all would have died. 38. An American man named Charles Francis Coughlin died far from home, but the ocean took him back. He passed away in Texas in 1899, and his coffin was placed in a tomb. But when a hurricane flooded the cemetery, his casket was carried out to sea. 8 years later, it washed ashore near his birthplace, Prince Edward Island, over 2,000 miles away. 39. A man who worked as a human crash test dummy had a car accident. The accident happened at just 5 miles per hour, but it was enough to kill the man. What are the odds that a human crash test dummy who makes their living surviving car accidents would die in a regular low-impact car accident? 40. The Declaration of Independence and the eerie connection between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Both men were instrumental in drafting the document in 1776. Both later became U.S. presidents, and, incredibly, both died on the exact same day, July 4, 1826, exactly 50 years after signing the Declaration of Independence. It's almost as if history tied them together until the very end. 41. In 1955, a man in Kansas bought a used car from a dealership. Inside the glove compartment, he found an old receipt signed by his own father decades earlier. Unknowingly, he had just purchased his dad's old car. 42. A Louisiana woman lost her wedding ring while swimming in a lake. She searched for days but never found it. 10 years later, while fishing in the same lake, her husband reeled in a fish. When they cut it open, guess what was inside? That same lost wedding ring. Either the fish had expensive taste, or it was just trying to return lost property. 43. In 2002, an Ohio woman was doing a genealogy project when she discovered an unsettling truth. Her husband, to whom she had been married for 15 years, was actually her long-lost cousin. They had grown up in different states and had no idea they were related. They stayed married, but, according to them, had a much weirder family tree. 44. During the Great Depression, a homeless man in New York found a winning lottery ticket on the ground. Instead of cashing it in, he gave it to the police, hoping they'd find the rightful owner. The city held on to it for a year, and when no one claimed it, they gave it back to the man. The jackpot? Over $100,000, enough to completely change his life. 45. In 1943, a young boy in Brooklyn was saved from drowning by a stranger. Years later, as an adult, he was in a restaurant and began choking. A waiter rushed over and performed the Heimlich maneuver, saving his life again. Only after thanking the waiter did he realize it was the same man who had saved him as a child. 46. A total solar eclipse passed over the battlefields of the American Revolutionary War in 1778, right as opposing forces were preparing for a fight. Both sides were so unnerved that they simply stopped fighting. Imagine preparing for war, and the universe itself gives you a dramatic pause button. 47. A president had a dream about his own funeral, just days before he died. In 1865, Abraham Lincoln told his wife and friends that he had dreamed of a White House funeral, with mourners gathered around a casket. When he asked who had died, a soldier in the dream told him, "The president?" 3 days later, Lincoln was assassinated. 48. A sports fan caught a home run ball on his birthday from his favorite player 2 years in a row. A die-hard Yankees fan caught a home run ball from Aaron Judge on his birthday. The next year, he attended another game on his birthday and caught a home run from Aaron Judge again. He joked that he should start bringing a lottery ticket too. 49. A man was saved by the same taxi driver, twice, in different states, 20 years apart. In 1940, a New York cab driver pulled a pedestrian out of the way of a speeding truck, saving his life. In 1960, that same man was in Chicago when a car nearly hit him again. A cab driver yanked him to safety. It was the exact same driver from 20 years earlier. 50. A man named Wilmer McLean had the Civil War start and end at his doorstep. The first major battle of the war took place near his farm in Virginia, so he moved to escape the conflict. Years later, the Confederate surrender was signed in his new home in Appomattox. He joked, "The war began in my front yard and ended in my parlor." 51. The first and last Apollo missions left Earth on the exact same date, 6 years apart. Apollo 7. The first crewed Apollo mission launched on October 11, 1968. Apollo 17, the last mission to send humans to the moon, launched on October 11, 1972. Despite years of planning, delays, and changes, NASA's biggest space program both started and ended on the same calendar date. 52. A man in Los Angeles accidentally left his wallet in a taxi in 1995. 3 years later, while visiting New York, he hailed another cab and was stunned to see his old wallet sitting on the dashboard. The driver said he had found it years ago and kept it in his car as a reminder to return lost items whenever possible. 53. A highway in Alabama was the site of 3 separate freak accidents in which the only thing left completely untouched in each wreck was a Bible sitting in the passenger seat. First responders nicknamed it the Untouchable Highway Bible because no matter the damage, it remained perfectly intact. 54. The first person to die in the construction of the Hoover Dam was J.G. Tierney in 1922. The last person? His son, 13 years later, on the same project. A father and son bookending one of the most dangerous engineering feats in U.S. history. 55. A major train crash in 1950 was eerily predicted by a journalist, hours before it happened. A reporter in New York was testing out a new typewriter and randomly typed out a story about a deadly train crash occurring outside the city. Just hours later, a real train derailed in almost the exact way he had described. His newspaper printed both his prediction and the actual event side by side. 56. A woman survived 2 mass shootings at different locations years apart. In 2012, a woman in Colorado survived the Aurora movie theater shooting. In 2017, she was in Las Vegas during the mass shooting at a country music festival and survived again. She later said, "I don't know why I'm still here, but I'm grateful." 57. A man in Texas survived 2 separate tornadoes 40 years apart. But both times, his house was the only one in the neighborhood destroyed. Neighbors joked that he must have had a personal storm cloud following him. After the second time, he moved to Arizona, just in case. 58. In 1987, 2 people sitting next to each other on a flight from Los Angeles to New York realized they had been childhood best friends who lost touch decades ago. Even crazier? They were both on standby and had been randomly assigned to sit next to each other. Call it fate, call it airline magic, but either way, the reunion was long overdue. 59. The US had a plan to invade Canada, and Canada had a plan to invade the US, and both plans were developed at the same time. In the 1920s, the US military created War Plan Red, a full-scale invasion strategy against Canada. At the same time, Canada developed Defense Scheme No. 1, a plan to invade the US preemptively. Neither country knew the other was making a plan. 60. In 1994, a man in Ohio was watching a documentary about shipwrecks when he saw something strange: his own last name on a lifeboat. Curious, he did some research and discovered that his great-grandfather had been the sole survivor of a shipwreck decades earlier. His family had never told him the story. 61. In 1972, a woman named Vesna Vulovic survived a fall from 33,000 feet after her plane exploded in midair. The strangest part? She wasn't even supposed to be on that flight. There was a scheduling mix-up that put her on board. She suffered multiple fractures but made a full recovery, becoming a walking testament to impossible survival stories. 62. In 1974, a taxi in Bermuda hit and killed a man on a moped. A year later, the same taxi, driven by the same driver carrying the same passenger, hit another man on a moped in the exact same spot. The second victim? The first victim's brother. 63. The Library of Congress has a book so rare that no one knew it existed until 2013. It was a handwritten journal from a Civil War soldier, found hidden inside an old desk purchased at a flea market. The journal contained detailed battle strategies that historians had never seen before, rewriting parts of what we thought we knew about the war. 64. A man named Enzo Ferrari, founder of the Ferrari car company, died in 1988. Just months later, soccer legend Mesut Ozil was born. Their faces, nearly identical. Side-by-side photos show an eerie resemblance, making people wonder if Ferrari had been reincarnated as a football star. 65. A man in Ohio won a $3 million lottery jackpot in 1998. Instead of celebrating, he told reporters he had a strange feeling something bad was coming. A month later, he was arrested for tax fraud. Within a year, He lost everything and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Sometimes, getting lucky isn't all it's cracked up to be. 66. During the filming of The Exorcist in 1973, a fire destroyed nearly the entire set, except for the room where the exorcism scenes were filmed. The production was delayed, actors reported strange accidents, and even a priest was brought in to bless the set. To this day, it's considered one of the most cursed movie productions ever. 67. The strange pattern of U.S. presidents elected in years ending in 0. Starting with William Henry Harrison in 1840, every president elected in a year ending in 0. Lincoln in 1860, Garfield in 1880, McKinley in 1900, etc. Either died in office or was assassinated, until Ronald Reagan, who survived an assassination attempt. The pattern was so strong it was called the Curse of Tecumseh. 68. The infamous outlaw Jesse James was killed by Robert Ford in 1882. Years later, Ford himself was shot and killed in a saloon by a man who idolized Jesse James. A revenge killing, decades after the fact, committed in honor of a criminal, only in the Wild West. 69. In 1984, a woman in Texas was waiting in line at a bank when an armed robber stormed in. Before he could do anything, a random customer tackled him, stopping the robbery. The woman was grateful until she realized the man who had just saved her was the same person who had mugged her 5 years earlier. 70. A Florida family owned a dog named Lucky. Over the years, Lucky survived being hit by a car, falling off a roof, and even getting lost in the Everglades for 2 weeks. Finally, when Lucky passed away of old age, they bought a tombstone for him that read, "The luckiest dog in the world." 2 days after placing it, lightning struck the tombstone, shattering it. 71. In 1973, 2 completely unrelated men were arrested in different states for bank fraud. When fingerprinting them, police discovered something impossible. They had identical fingerprints. DNA tests showed no relation, yet both men shared fingerprints so similar that forensic experts couldn't tell them apart. 72. In the 1800s, a doctor in Boston experimented with an early form of anesthesia. His first successful test? A man named William Sleeper. If that's not foreshadowing, I don't know what is. 73. A U.S. Navy ship vanished in the Bermuda Triangle, only for a nearly identical ship to disappear decades later in the same spot. In 1918, the USS Cyclops mysteriously disappeared without a trace, taking 309 crew members with it. Then, in 1941, its sister ship, the USS Proteus, vanished in the exact same part of the Bermuda Triangle. No wreckage from either ship was ever found. 74. A single vote changed the course of American history multiple times. In 1776, one vote decided that the U.S. would adopt English as its official language instead of German. A myth, but the real vote was extremely close. In 1845, one vote admitted Texas into the Union. And in 1923, one vote kept the U.S. from adopting the metric system, meaning that a single person's decision is why Americans still use inches and miles today. 75. In 2001, a New York firefighter rescued a baby girl from a burning apartment. Years later, in 2015, that same firefighter got trapped in a collapsed building during a rescue mission. The paramedic who pulled him out? The same girl he had saved 14 years earlier, now grown up and working as an EMT. 76. On April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln told his bodyguard he had no desire for extra security that evening. Hours later, he was assassinated at Ford's Theater. Exactly 95 years later, on April 14, 1950, a man tried to break into Lincoln's tomb to steal his body. Seems like April 14th had it out for Lincoln in more ways than one. 77. A Pennsylvania man survived 7 lightning strikes over the course of his life. But the most bizarre part? The day he passed away, at age 71, there was a lightning storm over his house. Nature really doesn't let grudges go. 78. A man won a brand new truck, twice, from the same dealership with the same contest. In 2016, a North Carolina man entered a local raffle and won a brand new Ford F-150. 2 years later, he entered again, joking that lightning wouldn't strike twice. It did. Same dealership, same contest, same model truck. 79. A delivery driver in Kentucky stopped at a gas station in 2013 and bought a lottery ticket on a whim. He won $250,000. The next year, at the same gas station, he bought another ticket and won again. His total winnings? $500,000. Some people are just built different. 80. In 1989, a New York cab driver was robbed at gunpoint. Years later, he switched careers and became a corrections officer. One day, while doing a routine check on inmates, he locked eyes with a prisoner, who immediately said, "Hey, didn't I rob you once?" 81. In 2013, a woman in California walked into a bookstore and picked up an old poetry book. Inside, on the first page, was an inscription written decades ago. "To my future wife, love always." The name in the book? Her husband's. He had lost it years before they ever met. 82. In 1912, Charles Lytler, the second officer of the Titanic, survived when the ship struck an iceberg and sank. But that wasn't his only brush with disaster. During World War I, he also survived the sinking of the HMS Falcon after it was struck by another vessel. Lytler later went on to serve in World War II, using his own boat to help evacuate soldiers during the Dunkirk rescue mission. If anyone had a lifetime of close calls at sea, it was him. 83. In the 1970s, a bank in Ohio hired a security guard who looked oddly familiar to the staff. Turns out, he had robbed that same bank 15 years earlier but had never been caught. He had assumed a new identity and, ironically, had been hired to protect the place he once stole from. 84. A man in Oregon found a wallet on the street and returned it to its owner. As a thank you, the owner gave him a lottery ticket. The next day, the man scratched it off and won $50,000. That's what you call instant karma. 85. A writer named Edgar Allan Poe once wrote a novel about 4 shipwrecked sailors who were forced to eat a cabin boy named Richard Parker. Years later, in a real shipwreck, the stranded sailors also resorted to cannibalism. Their victim? A young cabin boy named Richard Parker. 86. 2 unrelated men with the same name, living in different states, were killed by the same driver, 17 years apart. In 1952, a man named John P. Richter was struck and killed by a car in Florida. In 1969, another John P. Richter was hit by a car in Ohio. The driver? The exact same man. 87. A woman survived the sinking of the Titanic, Britannic, and Olympic. 3 sister ships, all involved in disasters. Her name was Violet Jessup, and after surviving 2 shipwrecks and a near-fatal collision, she just kept working on ships like nothing happened. Some called her the luckiest woman alive. Others said she was cursed. 88. In 1945, a man named Tsutomu Yamaguchi survived the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. He fled the city and traveled home to Nagasaki, only to experience the second atomic bombing 3 days later. Miraculously, he survived both blasts and lived to be 93 years old. 89. A New York woman received a postcard in 2008 that had been lost in the mail for 70 years. It was sent by her great-aunt during World War II, but never reached its destination. When the post office finally delivered it, the woman burst into tears because she had grown up hearing stories about this lost postcard her family always wished had arrived. 90. In 1950, a streetcar accident in New York left multiple people injured. Among them were 2 men, both named William Raymond, both born on the same day, and both working as insurance salesmen. Neither of them had ever met before. 91. The curse of the Kennedy-Lincoln connection runs deeper than you think. Lincoln was elected in 1846, Kennedy in 1946. Lincoln became president in 1860, Kennedy in 1960. Both were assassinated on a Friday. Both were succeeded by a Johnson, and both had secretaries with the other's last name. Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy, Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln, and that's not even all of it. 92. A U.S. Navy sailor survived the sinking of 3 different ships, all on the same date. George Plunkett was a sailor during World War II, and he somehow survived the sinking of 3 different ships, each time on April 7th of different years. His crew started calling him the walking bad luck charm, and some refused to board any ship he was assigned to. 93. A mother and daughter were both struck by lightning in the same spot, 30 years apart. The mother was hit while standing in her yard in 1955, surviving the strike. In 1985, her daughter was standing in the exact same place and was hit by lightning too. Both lived, but the family stopped standing there during storms. 94. The deadliest school massacre in U.S. history was almost forgotten because it happened on the same day as a major news event. On May 18, 1927, the Bath School bombing in Michigan killed 44 people, mostly children. But it was barely reported because Charles Lindbergh completed the first transatlantic flight the very next day, dominating headlines. 95. A soldier in World War I was saved when a bullet struck the Bible he kept in his pocket. Decades later, his grandson, also a soldier, was shot in combat, only to survive because the bullet hit the pocket-sized copy of the same Bible his grandfather had given him before deployment. 96. A Florida man survived being bitten by a shark, attacked by a bear, and bitten by a rattlesnake, all in 1 year. He said he had no plans to go hiking or swimming again anytime soon. Hard to blame him. 97. A flight in 1954 was delayed for mechanical issues, causing a businessman to miss his important meeting. Furious, he rebooked the next available flight and was shocked to learn that the original flight crashed, killing everyone on board. He sent the airline a thank you letter and never complained about delays again. 98. A farmer in Nebraska once lost his wedding ring while working in the fields. Years later, he pulled up a carrot from his garden, only to find the ring perfectly wrapped around it. His wife's reaction? Took you long enough to find it? 99. The CIA once tried to spy on the Soviet Union by using cats, but the first mission failed immediately. The CIA spent millions training a cat with implanted listening devices. On its first mission, they released it near a Soviet meeting point, and it was immediately hit by a taxi. After that, the project, called Acoustic Kitty, was quietly abandoned. 100. A Texas man walked into a store and saw a man who looked exactly like him. They laughed about it and took a photo together. A week later, they both took DNA tests. They were identical twins, separated at birth, neither knowing the other existed. 101. In 1948, a woman in Texas bought an old grandfather clock at an estate sale. The moment she placed it in her home, it stopped ticking. Thinking it was broken, she didn't bother fixing it. Years later, when she passed away, her family gathered in the house. Right at the moment of her death, the clock started ticking again. Some of these coincidences are so insane, they almost feel like fate or a glitch in reality. But here's the real question. Are these just random events, or is there something bigger at play? Let me know which one blew your mind the most in the comments. And if you think these were unbelievable, wait until you see what's coming next.